Hi everyone, my name is Tom Kemple. I teach social theory and the history of the social sciences and sociology. Today I'll be talking to you about neoliberal capitalism after COVID from my study here at home. So the lectures that I'll be giving are part of a unit on social institutions and social change. I'll be asking not just how can we understand the world, but how can we change it? The title I've chosen is COVID After Neoliberal Capitalism with a question mark. I'll be asking you and asking myself, what will the world look like after this pandemic? Now you might be asking why would I choose an article from Teen Vogue? It's not an academic journal, but it does have, I think, very good sociological analysis and political commentary. For example, the last time I access this article, one of the pop-ups was an article criticizing and asking questions about what makes this magazine profit, namely fast fashion. We should ask who's the author and why does this person have this particular perspective? Well, Candice Mallet is a former senior editor at Blavity, which is a internet media group for Black teen millennials. Since losing her job as senior editor, she's been writing quite a number of articles in other venues on the George Floyd protests. We should also ask who are the intended readers. As she says, it's for younger people, Gen Zers or Gen Zers, millennials. And we should ask how is the message connected to the medium? I myself access this on Facebook. You access this through the Canvas website. So we should think about the ways in which we read this on our iPhones, on our iPads, as part of the questions that she's asking about capitalism. As the great cultural theorist Marshall McLuhan put it, the medium is the message, and I would add that the medium has its own message. First, a quick disclaimer. No one has to agree with anything presented in this lecture or in this article. In fact, I encourage you to argue with it. Of course, most people think of sociology majors and profs like me, kind of like this, as my friends do, like this. My parents do think of me that way. This is, I think, what the general society thinks of sociology, mixing it up maybe with socialism or social activism. I don't really have a boss, but I do look like this some of the time. I do idealize certain public intellectuals like Noam Chomsky, and yet I actually spend most of my time behind computers like this. One of the things I'll be doing in this lecture is showing you some of the memes and ideas that I've been having since the declaration of the pandemic on March 11th. One of the first things that came through my social media feed was this meme. Weird how stock markets are plunging so much when no infrastructure has been destroyed and no natural resources have been depleted. Almost like all that value actually comes from people's labor. I wonder if anyone's written anything about this. Now, this is a mock-up of the cover of Marx's Capital, which I happen to be writing on right now. My lectures are going to be broken up into three parts. The first mini lecture will be this introduction, an introduction to neoliberal capitalism, and our key concept today will be formally free labor. The next mini lecture will be on COVID capitalism and the state, and the third on anti-capitalist society after COVID, again with a question mark. Now the article begins by stating frankly that, well, we sort of all know this. Now we can disagree with this, but she says this is part of our everyday common sense. This pandemic, she says, has brought into sharper relief what some of us have always known to be true. She does then state her thesis or argument. Capitalism and the culture of hierarchy that props it up is extremely screwed up. Okay, now we need to define some terms here, and fortunately articles like this, which you get on social media, offer quick hyperlinks to definitions to give us some more depth and background, sort of like a footnote in a academic article. So she provides a link to another Teen Vogue article, which defines capital as an economic system in which a society's trade, industry, and profits are controlled by private companies instead of by the people whose time and labor powers those companies. So capitalism is a system in which most things are controlled through private companies rather than through people's labor. Now, I think of capitalism over the last several decades in our lifetime as a particular form which I'll call neoliberal capitalism. So that's a word that you read a lot, but let's try to come up with at least a rough and ready definition which we can readily access on Wikipedia down here. Neoliberalism is the 20th century resurgence of 19th century ideas associated with laissez-faire economic liberalism and free market capitalism. It is generally associated with policies of economic liberalization, including privatization, deregulation, globalization, free trade, austerity, and reductions in government spending in order to increase the role of the private sector in the economy and in society. Now, rather than looking up all of those hyperlinks, I think we can break it down to this last part here. Neoliberalism is an economic system. It's a historical stage of capitalism, which supports an increasing role in the private sector in the economy. Okay, so increasing role of the private rather than the public sector. Now, neoliberalism didn't come out of nowhere. Okay, neoliberal capitalism, I'm arguing, dates from about the late 1960s, the end of the countercultural movement, especially in the Western world, up to the financial crisis of 2008, which I'll return to in a moment. As our definition a moment ago pointed out to us, it's a resurgence of 19th century liberal or laissez-faire capitalism. Now that economic system was theorized by the classical sociologists Karl Marx and Max Weber in terms of three core features, and these will be the structuring concepts for my mini lecture. One is that capitalism is based on apparently or formally free labor. All work has to be done for a wage. It's based on free enterprise, that is, the rule of private companies and corporations, rather than by democratically elected governments. Third, it's based on so-called free markets, on international trade, which is supposedly done among equal partners. Now we're going to raise questions about those in this and in the following lectures. Let's start with our first key concept, formally free labor. Now all labor has to be done for a contract. Okay, that is, a wage or an income or a salary is legally guaranteed for certainly a certain amount of hours or time worked. And work conditions are supposedly assumed to be good enough to get the work done. However, as the coronavirus continues to spread throughout the United States, in Canada, and the rest of the world, people with jobs that put them in physical contact with many others are at the greatest risk of becoming sick. So not all work contracts, not all work conditions are created equal. Some, like lawyers with very little contact, very little physical proximity to others, have less exposure, low exposure to the virus. On the other end, higher up are janitors who have relatively less proximity to others but a higher exposure to others, nurses, cashiers, personal care workers, and so on, aides. Those are higher risk to disease and to viruses. So not all formally free labor is created equal. Now, to get back to our article, our author is lost her job. Getting laid off during a pandemic, she writes, isn't the best thing that could have happened, but I'm coping. Okay, she gets to take dance classes. She has a lot more free time. And she's been doing apparently some freelance work for magazines like Teen Vogue. I find myself both without a steady income and without health insurance. Great. We'll return to that point. If you lose your job and don't come from money, if you're not rich, there's an instant fear of how you'll be able to survive. So she's identified a problem. The problem here is healthcare is tied to work, particularly in the United States, okay, less so here in Canada. Work is tied to housing, okay? As she puts it, selling your labor in a capitalist marketplace so you don't end up on the street is horrible and unnatural, and we shouldn't have to exist this way, okay? We shouldn't have to worry about how healthy we can remain if we go to work, and whether we can even pay rent if we have to stay home. Now, of course, she's raising the big question about capitalism, which is the increasing polarization between rich and poor. Rich celebrities like Kris Jenner are getting tested for coronavirus without having symptoms, while regular people who do show symptoms, have a tough time getting tests. Now, she's talking about professional athletes, about celebrities, and of course about politicians who in the early days of the pandemic were able to quickly get tests. That's becoming a bit less of a factor now. Now, when asked about those disparities, Trump said, well, perhaps that's just the story of life. Now, Mallet says, well, it might not be the story of life, but it's definitely the story of capitalism. Okay, and you could say that neoliberal capitalism is built on the assumption that what's actually specific to a particular period of history and a particular times and places and for particular people is actually just a natural condition which we can't change. Okay, Mallet wants to undermine that assumption. Now, before we slag on celebrities completely, Britney Spears, as some of you may know, was quite outspoken in the early weeks of the pandemic by saying that it exposed the great disparities in wealth and the need for the redistribution of resources between rich and poor. Okay, speaking of herself and ready to sign a check pretty much for anybody who asked for it. I don't know how that's turned out. So here's how our author sort of resonates with that sentiment. If we are to fully examine the crisis for what it is, then we must recognize that COVID-19 is not the only virus that must be destroyed. We also have to confront capitalism and the world that sustains it. Or as Britney puts it, capitalism is the virus. Now, in my next lecture, I'm going to talk a bit about COVID capitalism, not just as a question of wealth, but also as a question of politics and government, the state.